welcome to the A Minute to Midnight show, folks. This is Tony coming to you from New Zealand, and on with me today I have my good friend and A Minute to Midnight teammate, Matt, who is also here in New Zealand, about an hour's drive from me. So it's great to be doing this again, Matt. It's been, I think, a couple of months probably since we did our last one.
Yes, it is, yeah. Hi, Tony, and hi, folks. It's been a little while, but it's good to be back again.
Sure is. So we've got a few things to talk about today, which I think will be pretty interesting. It's certainly crazy times we're living in, Matt, and maybe that's where we should start.
Yes, absolutely. Something that I noticed recently, although saying that it's kind of been a little bit, would seem to have been a bit quiet lately, but there was a interesting article that I saw recently with regard to Donald Trump and Paula White, and it just, for me, it was probably more annoying than anything else. But the headline was, "An apocalyptic myth helps explain Trump support." It talked about Donald Trump and the whole kind of King Cyrus, the effect, and how this was being driven by fundamentalist Christians who had an agenda to, take over the world and use Donald Trump to do that. And Paula White, her name was mentioned. She's one of the advisors to Donald Trump. What I think annoyed me most was that it was an article that was basically being used to bash Christians, but it seemed to be lumping Christians into one kind of box, so to speak, and that Christians were using Donald Trump to pursue an agenda. Now, there was a prophecy. I'd never heard of this before. It was called the Last Emperor prophecy. Tony, have you heard of that?
I hadn't until I saw the article myself.
Right. Yeah. So, and that was new to me as well, but apparently it's an old a Catholic eschatological end times prophecy, and this reporter was using this. I think the thing that annoys me is that you have people like Paula White, who's very much associated with New Apostolic Reformation, pushing these types of agendas, pushing Donald Trump as being the Cyrus-type individual. And we know full well that Cyrus was prophesied, he was spoken about in the Bible. Donald Trump isn't spoken about in the Bible. And so why they would be pushing this agenda with him and then giving media opportunity to bash Christians, I just find this frustrating and annoying.
Yeah, of course, it started off with Lance Wall now penning that whole Cyrus thing, and then Mark Taylor, of course, jumping on and with his Trump prophecies and all that, and then wham, we end up with a whole heap of Christians suddenly thinking Donald Trump's God's chosen, and really our purpose is not to bash Donald Trump and to support the Democrats or something, because they're worse probably or just as bad or whatever. But it's the point of the matter is that it's just been taken to this crazy extreme, and like you say, it can then be used against Christians, whilst really what a lot of these people are doing a dominionist agenda, a part of a dominionist agenda. And it's interesting, that apocalyptic prophecy that you just mentioned about the last world emperor. Just according to this article, which, by the way, was on stuff.co.nz, and it was titled "An Apocalyptic Myth Helps Explain Trump Support." But that last world emperor, it says in this article, originates in the apocalyptic sermon known as Pseudo-Methodius, written in Syriac between 685 AD and 690, after the Arab conquest of the Middle East. So, I'll let you carry on, Matt.
Yeah, and that's something I'd never heard of that. That's something I didn't. I was completely unaware. There's probably some of you folks out there may have heard of that, but that's certainly the first time. The other thing too is that this, once again, this is not scriptural. It doesn't tie in with anything biblically. So they're just launching into this. It's interesting. I feel like the Hegelian dialectic is also coming into play a bit here, where you've got one side who, with the mainstream media, secularists who see Christians supporting Donald Trump, calling him, King Cyrus, who wish to take over the world and control. And let's face it, that's what Dominionism wants to do. That, and we know that that's their agenda, that's their belief, that's what they want to do. But we know from scriptural perspectives that this is not correct. That Dominionism is not a scriptural principle. It is not a Christian thing. It very much ties in with even New World Order agendas and things like that. So I think if anyone hears these things, and once, Tony, as you say, we're not bashing Donald Trump. We're just saying that there are Christians out there that want to use Donald Trump to support their agenda. And of course, that plays into Donald Trump. I think he quite likes the idea of seeing himself as a King Cyrus type figure. But in that respect, he's being used, and unfortunately, it puts Christians in a very bad light.
Yeah, and in that article, just looking at it again, it actually, just read a little bit. It says Perry's, that's talking about Rick Perry and Paula White, implicit allusions to this tradition would just be rhetoric if others in the administration weren't actively bolstering similar notions. Within the government, Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Education Secretary Betty DeVos, and others bolster the connection between Trump's presidency and the promise of a Christian empire.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah. So with these situations where you get media finding issues like this with Paula White, who's one of Donald Trump's advisors. Donald Trump, I think he does like to think of himself as the Messiah. This article points to that. And but I don't think that he's a King Cyrus, and I don't think, yes, it's quite possible that God is using him as he uses as all people, but it just puts Christians in a, particularly when all Christians get lumped together under this, it puts us in a bad light. And I just wanted to make comment about this, really, just to say that this is not what Christians are. We don't believe this. If you're a Bible-believing Christian, you wouldn't accept this. Yes, Donald Trump's the President of the United States. He's got a very responsible job in doing that. But, it's not anything that, it's not, from a Christian perspective, for me, I don't believe that he's got a particular biblical role to fulfill, essentially.
Yeah, I'll just we'll get off this, but just a little piece near the end of this article, which was written by a guy called Thomas, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Lekaku or something, who is a assistant professor of history at the Grandview University in Iowa. But he says this: we may laugh when President calls himself the chosen one or likens himself to the King of Israel or like the second coming of God, and it's even possible that he's joking when he borrows this religious vocabulary. But there are people who take him and this ideology seriously. So yeah, that's the thing. It's like I think I've used the analogy a few times. To me, I just think it sums it up pretty well. When you have a Western movie and people are conditioned to watch these movies, and you always have a good guy and a bad guy, and everyone's barracking for the good guy to win and get the bad guy, and so you've always got this black and white thing, a good guy and a bad guy. But life isn't always like that. It's entirely possible to have flawed people on both sides of things, and as you mentioned earlier, the Hegelian dialectic, Matt, I think that sums it up pretty well. You've got a left and a right here. Neither side in the extremes is right, and it's time we got our eyes off politicians and back onto God ultimately, because politicians are not the answer and they don't have the answer.
Right, and they don't. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. I think with seeing all these things that are happening in the States at the moment, and something that's just recently come to my attention, I listen to John Haller regularly, and Tony, you have him on A Minute to Midnight regularly, and John often talks about the chaotic state of the world, and he mentions quite a few different countries that are in a state of unrest at the moment. So I decided to do a little bit of an exercise to see how, reflective in our own media, what John talked about was there. So he talked about countries like Venezuela, Chile, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Hong Kong, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon. These are all countries that have, and this is by no means the whole list, but these are countries where there's a lot of unrest going on at the moment. So I checked into New Zealand's mainstream media to see what was mentioned about any of these countries, and there was very little. There are about 4 main media sources that I checked, and there might have been between all 4 2 articles that relate to any of the unrest that's going on. I think one talked about Hong Kong, and another one talked about Iraq and how recently the Prime Minister of Iraq has resigned due to the unrest that's going on there. But I don't remember any mention of the unrest being about Iran in terms of the protests in Iraq at the moment. So it'd be interesting to hear from people who are listening to this today, because we've probably got people from many different countries listening, as to whether or not your own mainstream media are reporting the unrest that's going on in the world at the moment. And there's a lot of it. Venezuela, we've heard about in the alternative media for quite some time. The problems continue there. The poverty, just the general sorry state of the economy there, it still continues to go on. But surprisingly, there are countries like Chile where there's been a lot of unrest just recently. Chile, I think they had an increase in the government increased bus fares, and this was just enough to tip the country into protesting. So you have this going on, but we didn't hear anything about this in our own mainstream media here in New Zealand. Israel, there's a lot going on with their election system at the moment. It looks like that they may have to go into an unprecedented 3rd term of elections in Israel. They have a very similar system there to what we do in New Zealand. So it's very easy to reach a stalemate if you haven't got like a clear winner in the election. You don't hear about that. You don't hear about the missiles that have been launched into Israel from the Gaza Strip. The thing that I did hear about in our own mainstream media was that Benjamin Netanyahu was being indicted. There was an article about that, but nothing else, which is very one-sided kind of journalism, because they're certainly not reporting everything that's going on. They'd much rather talk about climate change agendas. That's something, Tony, we can get onto shortly. I've got an interesting article about that. They'd rather talk about anything but the real issues that are facing the world at the moment. Iraq, I mentioned there are huge protests going on there about Iran's interference in Iraq. The Iranian embassy was burned down recently. Iran is having huge problems at the moment as well. They're having big protests over things that are going on there, big price hikes in petrol, those sorts of things. And I believe that there's some 200 odd people, it may be more now, who have been killed, been shot dead in these protests. But we're not hearing about any of that in our own media here. Hong Kong is one thing that we have heard about, and that those unrests continue. But what I read about the other day was that that unrest has now spread into mainland China. That's not something I've picked up in our media here. I'll just see if I can find, there's an article that I found recently that discussed here it is. It's from Breitbart News. The article says protesters within China defy communists just like you, Hong Kong. That's the title of the article. And it's saying that protesters in southern Guangdong, I don't know if I've got that right, the Guangdong province, China, took to the streets last week to demand the communist government not build a polluting crematorium near their town. And they were adopting slogans that were common to the Hong Kong protests. So what's happened in Hong Kong seems to have filtered through into the mainland China at the moment, which is interesting. So I'd expect that we'll probably see a fairly heavy crackdown on that shortly from the Chinese government, because they don't like anything like this, anything that makes them look bad. Where else we've got interesting, Jordan at the moment, is they've recently held a military exercise which looked like it would, and from the sounds of things, it was an exercise which would be seen as going against Israel. It was an exercise that was in preparation for perhaps some kind of military conflict with Israel. There are things like this going on. Lebanon, there are protests that have been going on there for a while. We don't hear about that in our media. As we know, Syria, that's just an ongoing horrific conflicted battlefield. You've got Turkey in the northern parts of Syria who have been moving in and cleansing, ethnically cleansing. I don't know if that's the right word, Tony, the Kurdish parts of northern Syria. We've seen the issues going on between the government forces in Syria, and there are still groups of terrorists who are still, fighting. That hasn't changed. So it's a whole mess around that area. Going to Europe, interesting the things that are going on there that we don't hear about. And this, I've found an article recently from Gatestone. Gatestone, if you don't get it, Gatestone, they have an email feed for their articles. It's very worthwhile. You have some really good articles coming through from them. There were recently an article came through. It says Norway's top cop seems baffled by free speech, but not the inviolability of the Quran. So in short, there was a group that recently had a Quran burning in Norway. If you've been following the migrant crisis that's been afflicting Europe, Norway has taken a lot of Muslim migrants in recent years, and as a result of that, there's quite a big population of Muslim people there now. The Norwegian political system has been supporting these people, the Islamic migrants, to the point that things like if someone wanted to burn a Quran, it's now they're talking about making that hate speech. So people aren't free to express their opinion over there anymore. Interestingly enough, something that happened also probably a few days ago, there was a Christian man who was beaten by 4 Muslims on his way home from church, I believe. He's a street preacher. He was beaten by 4 Muslims. They robbed him and they threatened to kill him if he didn't convert to Islam. So nothing about that, apart from this article that came once again through Breitbart. Nothing official that, he wasn't supported by the powers that be, the government in any way. So you've got this very much government supporting the Islamic refugees that come through, but for their own people, they're not being supported. And it's got to the point where even the locals are not wanting to do anything that would offend the Muslim immigrants. For example, they won't buy Christmas cards or send Christmas cards just because they feel that would be offensive to Muslims, and yet Christianity is the official religion of Norway. What are the other things that have been going on? Climate change stuff. Here's an interesting article that I picked up on Breitbart News as well too. And it talks about, I don't know if you've seen this one, Tony. There was a Danish academic. His name was Professor Weaver. I'm not sure if I've got that pronunciation right, but he was in Australia. And the article was entitled, Danish Academic, UN Might Use Military to Enforce Climate Agenda. And
haven't seen that one.
No, okay, I can send you the URL. It's really, what he was saying is that the United Nations may resort to military action against states that defy its mandates on global climate action. I'm reading from the article. According to Ole Weaver, this is the professor, he says that more resistance to change could potentially threaten democracy, although the UN would counter that and the end justified the means. So what he's saying is that if you've got climate change policies to set, for example, talking about reducing carbon emissions, blah, 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 if countries are not meeting those targets, then that it's possible that perhaps the military could be used to enforce those policy targets. He believes that classifying climate change as a security issue could leave the door open to more extreme policy responses. And that's a real concern. But when you think about it, this is how we might see a one world government forming as a result of this.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
it's interesting because you were talking about protests before, and we had farmers here in New Zealand turned up at Parliament a few weeks ago protesting the the anti-carbon legislation here in New Zealand, and they were pretty much ridiculed by the politicians there. Nobody took the farmers' concerns seriously, which, I mean, it's crazy. We've had farmers protesting in Germany. We've blocking up highways with their tractors. Same thing in Holland.
Yes, that's right.
But the mainstream media doesn't report these things like you were saying. It's just you have to find out through alternative means. But there are a lot of farmers. But because there is an agenda to push this fake climate change scam to help bring in the UN's world government, anything that's against that or that highlights things that are, dubious, the mainstream media just shuts it all down. You just don't hear about it. But they're quite happy to push Greta Thunberg and people like that to the forefront. It's kind of infuriating because you feel like you're pushing water uphill with a rake trying to tell people about it. And even I notice, I make videos about climate change. I've made a few now, and I could do more. But the amount of views they get, it's like quite disappointing, really, because it's just, to me, it shows you how many big holes there are in the arguments for man-made climate change, for which there actually is no proof. The mainstream media will try and tell you something else, but actually there is none. There is not one single shred of proof for man-made climate change. But anyway, so I digress here. But so carry on there, Matt.
No, that's right. There isn't, and you see anyone that and it's interesting. It's like the term conspiracy theorist. We now have the term climate denier. Anyone that says, "Hang on a minute, is the science that you're presenting about climate change, is that good science? Is it real science?" They just get shouted down. They get and that's what concerns me, is that people like Greta Thunberg, I don't think would be prepared to consider an alternative. They have a very set, very focused view on what they're doing, and anyone that speaks out against that, it basically is the enemy. Tony, you've had Scott on about the
Grand solar
minimum. Yeah, grand solar minimum. And there's a lot of good science that would suggest that the sun has a great deal to do with our climate and the changes that can occur in our climate. But I've never heard that realistically being looked at or considered as a possible cause. I mean, I don't deny that there are things that are changing in our climate, because there are things that are changing. I mean, we had seen some quite extreme weather. We've seen extreme cold, massive snowstorms in the States, and we're seeing some warmer temperatures, but people don't look and think, well, is there another reason for this? Because, as you say, Tony, the evidence to support man-made issues here are very scant. Volcanoes produce far more carbon than polluting, the pollution that man produces, the carbon footprint of man. To say that we're causing all these changes, as you say, Tony, there's been really very little good evidence to support that.
Of course, on the other end too, they also don't do anything about geoengineering. You're a tinfoil hat wearer if you mention geoengineering, but there are reports of people that have had snow analysed on their properties and things, and it's full of barium, aluminium, and strontium, and so on, the very things that people are saying this is what chemtrailing does. And you get tests done and that's what's there. So how much does geoengineering actually affect the weather? I'm no expert, I can't really say, but it probably at least locally does in localized areas. And it's really a one-trick pony, this whole climate change made by man in terms of carbon and methane emissions. And you mentioned the volcanoes, and of course a lot of them are under the sea and also under the ice, which do produce way more methane, and same with swamps. Methane produced by swamps far outweighs what man does, but it's just because it's a one-trick pony to bring in a new world order. I think basically the climate change agenda is the mechanism that they're using as an excuse for world government.
Yeah, cutting to the chase, at the end of the day, this is where it's all headed, in terms of it's creating chaos in order to bring in someone who will put the world to rights, so to speak. We're seeing, and John Heller talks about this often, it's the chaos that we see in the world, and we see governments that appear to be quite useless at decision making, that quite useless at being able to provide answers. And often you see governments creating situations that, in fact, create more chaos. Europe's a classic example where you've had all the migrants from Middle East and Northern Africa come in. They've caused huge problems, but this is, people fail to recognise and see that it's politicians that have caused a lot of the problems here. So yeah, just once again, as I said before, if you're not living in New Zealand, or even if you are, check your mainstream media to see which mainstream media companies are actually reporting on these kind of unsettled crisis situations that are occurring in countries around the world, because here in New Zealand, we get very little to nothing. So you would be left thinking, that there is, the world's cruising along and things are going okay, when in actual fact it's quite the opposite at the moment. Just something as an aside, we've talked about Israel Folau. He was the Australian rugby player who posted on social media in a response to a question about, he quoted scripture in regard to what would happen, that gay people, adulterers, drunks wouldn't go to heaven and that they were sinners. And of course, this was met with him ending up having to resign from his position as a rugby player with Rugby Australia. He was absolutely lambasted in the press. He really got a hammering here in New Zealand in our own press. I collected quite a number of articles about just people just running him down for his belief. And yet he was actually just expressing what the Bible says about people who are sinners. So it wasn't as if he was saying, these things from his own belief. It was actually scriptural belief. So I believe that he has reached a settlement with Rugby Australia that I understand will probably favour him, that they'll be making a payment to him. But there was a comment made by a Australian journalist in the Sydney Morning Herald. And I'll just read some of that to you, just to give you an idea of what people are thinking about him. So it says here, "Where to now for Folau? I have no clue. We know he won't be playing professional rugby or rugby league in Australia. I would be surprised if he had played either game for big bucks anywhere else in the global football world. His name is anathema. The issues that led both Australian rugby and rugby league to run screaming from the room at the idea of having them in their jersey applies equally to professional football outfits around the world, who must deal with their own supporters and sponsors. Yes, Folau could promise to not post anything controversial again, but what would that promise be worth? How much could it be counted on? He made the same promise, the commitment to RA, and did it anyway, which I don't believe that that's true. I repeat, I suspect his serious football career is over. Proselytizing in his parents' backyard is what remains, and whatever else he can do to make a living. Goodbye, Israel. You'll be remembered as a greatly gifted player who was nevertheless a disaster for rugby. The day you severed the final strands of your relationship with Rugby Australia was a good day for the game. Good day to you, I say, good day." That, to me, is a very sad sentiment. It's like, here's a guy who's a Christian, and through social media that was unrelated to anything to do with rugby, he was talking scripture. He was actually just putting scripture through. Now, my understanding was that the CEO of Qantas vigorously pursued having him fired from rugby. And also, I would say, my understanding is that the CEO of Qantas, it's also a man he's a gay man as well too. So he took great offence at what Israel Folau was saying, that Qantas is a sponsor of Rugby Australia. So he said, get rid of this guy. His beliefs don't fit with what I believe, therefore you need to get rid of him. I would say that at the end of the day, that's probably how it was. I could be wrong, but I think that's pretty much why they had to get rid of him. But it's just a shame that because he has Christian views, how many other people in the sporting world have Christian beliefs? But now they won't it's like they're going to be gagged from expressing those things. Where does this go to? It's not just Israel Folau. It's anyone that would want to express a Christian belief. Is this the beginning of persecution for Christians? And that's my question. Is that what we're going to be seeing now, particularly in the Western world? Tony, do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, actually. I will probably end up making another video, separate video about Pope Francis's moves towards one world religion. But I just want to tie this bit, just a little section in here, just for saving time. But on the 18th of November, Pope Francis had this to say. This is from an official transcript. Beware of the fundamentalist groups. Everyone has his own. In Argentina too, there is a little fundamentalist corner. And let us try with fraternity to go forward. Fundamentalism is a scourge, and all religions have some kind of fundamentalist first cousin there, which forms a group. He mentioned Argentina there. Well, the only fundamentalists in Argentina are Christians. There are no Muslim fundamentalists or Hindu fundamentalists in Argentina. He's talking about Christian fundamentalists, and I imagine people like Israel Folau would fit in to his definition of a fundamentalist. And this comes from an article here that was written by Michael Snyder. Michael says, of course, a scourge is another way of saying a plague. And what do we try to do to a plague when one breaks out? That's something to think about. So really, when you say, is persecution coming? I think fundamentalists that do not fit in with, the all-inclusive one-world religion, and eventually which is not going to tolerate anything that is straight up Bible, like Israel Folau taught. That is where it's going to happen. And I just want to read just something from 1 John, and this is in chapter 2, and it says here, who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father either. He who acknowledges the Son has the Father also. Therefore let that abide in you which you have heard from the beginning. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, and you also will abide in the Son and in the Father. And this is the promise that he has promised us, eternal life. Now, Pope Francis and whoever else can shake hands and try and form some sort of religious alliance with Buddhists and Hindus and Islamic clerics and whatnot, and we can try and stuff everyone into the box and not talk about, like Israel Folau does, who gets into the kingdom of heaven and who doesn't. But the point of the matter is, the Bible says something, and we either believe that or we don't. And that is where it really comes down to the crux of the matter. If we end up speaking Bible verses that these people don't like, then persecution is going to come. And it will come at the hands of a lot of different sources, and eventually the move towards a one world religion, which will not tolerate anything that doesn't fit in with it. And of course that'll tie in with the one world government as well, with their climate change agenda and all that. I can see it all packaging together, at some point to form this kind of attempt at a united religion and government. And there's a lot more I could say about Pope Francis, but basically I think I'll end up making another short video on it. But those are my thoughts. And I suppose, Matt, what do you got that we should maybe close up with?
Well, Pope Francis has been very, very busy lately. He's been making contact not only with Islamic leaders, but with Buddhist leaders. And also I see that the head of the Salvation Army has approached him recently, also he's seems to be headed down this very interfaith ecumenical path, which we would see as the hallmark of a one world religion, which would tie in with the Antichrist New World Order agenda. So if he's, like you say, if he's speaking out against fundamentalist Christians, who are, I would say, would be Bible-believing Christians, because if Pope Francis knew his Bible, if he knew his scripture, he would know. John 14:6 says, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So there's only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. We can't get to God through Hinduism. We can't get through Buddhism. We can't get through Islam. So if he's suggesting that that is the way to get to God and that those things are all acceptable to God, then I don't know who his God is, because it's certainly not the same God that I would worship, the God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob.
Well, just quickly before you finish, from Pope Francis's February the 4th, that declaration he signed with the Imam of Al-Azhar, he said that the declaration said, the pluralism and diversity of religions, colour, sex, race and language are willed by God in his wisdom through which he created human beings. So Pope Francis is basically saying there that God willed the diversity of religions. Right,
so I'm not sure which God he's talking about, but it's certainly not the God of the Bible.
Totally.
Yeah. That's about all I have to say on that, Tony.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. It's been a really interesting discussion. And people, make sure that if you do not know the God of the Bible, if you have not had a salvation experience, go to aminutemidnight.com and check out our How to Be Saved page, which Brooke Ardwin put together some time back. So I would suggest people go there for a start if you do not know salvation through Jesus Christ. Also, while talking about the website, folks, if you visit aminutemidnight.com, all our articles and shows are put there, as well as on iTunes and YouTube. Please make sure you're subscribed to our various channels and following our website. Sometimes people are being unsubscribed from YouTube in particular, so check your subscription there. And also, if you're able to donate to A Minute to Midnight, that would be much appreciated. Basically, donations are pretty much my only income these days, and they haven't been very good lately, I'll be honest, and I've got some big expenses, so not wanting to make people feel bad, but if anyone's able to donate at the moment, it would be greatly appreciated. And of course, also, if there's enough, Matt, I try and send you some money as well as part of the A Minute to Midnight team. So, folks, we'd really love it if you're able to help us out. That would be brilliant. And also the music in the shows I've written, played and recorded, and you can download that on the website too. Any last thoughts, Matt, as we close up?
Just thanks everyone for listening to this, and as I said earlier, just be interested to hear back from any of our listeners about what their thoughts are on their media in their countries and whether or not they do report on these things. And as Tony said before, if you don't know Jesus, you need to get to know him, because he's the only way that you're going to be able to have a relationship with God. And there is a devil out there that doesn't want you to get to know Jesus, and I tell you what, it's the only thing that's the most important decision that you'll ever get to make. So thanks folks, thanks Tony.
Yeah, and thank you too, Matt. Great way to close out. So folks, hopefully you'll be back with another A Minute to Midnight episode in a few days' time. Until then, God bless and have a great week.